Kia ora koutou. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. I am joined by Dr. Ben Peters, who is our candidate in Dunedin. Hey, Ben.
Kia ora. Thank you for
How
having
are
me
you?
again. I'm very good. We're at the end of mid-semester break. I've had a couple days off, well, of work at least, not really off top, but feeling a bit refreshed and ready to get back into the semester and to even more work here at top coming up to the election, which is very soon-ish.
That's so awesome. I know, soon-ish.
So
And
could
yet
have
we
been
had
sooner.
this.
Could have been
Could have
sooner.
been. Yep, it really could have been. But apparently, technology is a bit weird for some political parties
Yeah.
to adapt to.
Yeah. The old, I mean, personally, I don't mind not knocking on doors. It was almost going to be my campaign slogan. I won't interrupt you at your home. So, I mean, we've got an extra 4 weeks. We'll see what happens as we come on. But we'll keep doing this online and keep reaching out. Clearly showing our innovative spirit at top.
Exactly, right? And if we have to adapt and evolve, then that's what we will do.
Exactly.
So Ben, in case there's anybody new watching this evening, you are a scientist. Can you tell anyone watching and meeting you for the first time tonight a little bit about your background?
Sure. So I did my undergraduate degree in biochemistry. So I did it half at Canterbury and half down in Otago. I got through 2 years and then I moved to Dunedin because my girlfriend at the time was doing a course down here that wasn't offered at Canterbury, but my degree was offered at Otago. So I shifted. She's now my wife, so it was a very good move. So that went really well. I did an undergrad. Yeah, things played out pretty well there. I got an honours degree, so that was first class honours in biochemistry here at Otago, and then I spent a little bit of time working as an assistant research fellow. Again, in that project, I was looking at plant reproduction, particularly around pollen development, and then I moved into doing a PhD here at Otago as well, which took 4 years ish. I handed in on the day of my 4th year. It took another year to get it marked because PhDs can be notoriously slow on that.
Hey, wait,
anyway,
hang on, just pause on that. 1 year.
Yeah, I had an international examiner that just never got back to us. So it just sat with that person for 6+ months before they had to find another examiner to go over it, because they do want to, be pretty, there's a high bar at the end of the day to get through with PhD. And so, but got through all that. Now I'm employed at the university teaching biochemistry and doing a little bit of lab development, a little bit of tinkering here and there. So yes, heavy background in science there, and I think I still consider myself a scientist because I still get into the lab occasionally and play with some chemicals.
Totally. You are our scientist. And for anyone watching, that is the reason why we're here tonight, because there are very few people who are actually equipped to answer your COVID questions, who understand the science behind it and what it all means and how to kind of translate it into language that us lay people can actually understand. So I thought we did this a couple of weeks ago now, Ben, but let's just assume everyone's watching didn't see it. So just super quick. Actually, I just think it's important because I've just seen a funny comment come up. Is David Clark following the current alert level guidelines or restrictions? And why that's funny, everyone, is because Ben is running against David Clark and also Michael Woodhouse, two people who I am quite frankly baffled still have a job. But anyway, I digress, and I could talk about that all night, but that's not why we're here to talk about COVID. So
the last time I saw David Clark, I was at a youth council meeting yesterday. We had some great back and forth, but yes, we were following guidelines on that. We had a limited audience, and we sat far apart from each other. So I think the last time I checked, yes, we were. It's hard to break rules at level 2. There's not a lot you have to do. So.
Okay, good. Although you guys at least get 100 or 99 friends, and up here in Auckland, we're only going to be allowed to hang out with 9 friends. But anyway, that's okay. We'll make it work. At least we get to see people, which is going to be a huge improvement on where we are right now.
Oh, yes.
So Ben, super quick, COVID. Did it come out of a lab? Did China just create it in a lab to piss us all off?
No, so all the evidence that we have so far shows that there was a single jump from an animal into a human, and then from there was spread. That jump probably happened a little bit before the Wuhan wet market, which is often considered, the starting point. It's probably not actually there. That was probably where someone went and then spread it more widely, just because when you look at the kind of the timelines of things, there were some cases that were coming up before then, some cases around that time that were not linked with the wet market. So there was some in circulation a little bit earlier, but most likely that was a transmission from a bat to a human. Potentially it was bat to pangolin to human. These viruses can jump around a bit. Fortunately, zoonotic events, so that just means animal to people events, are pretty rare, so they don't happen that often. And we've been really lucky with this one that has only happened once. So a very related virus, MERS, it jumps from camels to people. It's a Middle Eastern respiratory syndrome. And that happens somewhat frequently. And so whenever that crops up, they have a little outbreak. So it's really hard to stamp that one out permanently. Whereas this time, it seems to have only happened once. So that's quite fortunate. So,
okay, so we don't need to keep worrying about all the bats that are going to keep sending us all the new COVID.
We do need to be aware, and I think we need to keep doing research into the viruses that are circulating in the animal kingdom that we're potentially susceptible to. And a lot of the conspiracy coming out of this was because there was research years ago, kind of 2012-ish, I think, going, look, we really need to be aware of this. Ebola is another one, which I think resides mostly in bats, and you can kind of track the Ebola outbreaks based on the migratory path of bats. Many other diseases kind of have times where they live in animal hosts and then they jump to humans. Malaria is another one that's really common there as well. So we do need to be very aware. Or it's Zika virus as well, dengue. So there's tons of viruses out there in the wild that do cross over to people. We do need to be aware of them. We do need to kind of have good research going on into these areas. But for COVID specifically, it seems to have happened once, probably because once that particular evolution of the COVID virus, the SARS-CoV-2, jumped into people, that animal was no longer around. And so that was probably the one entry in.
Okay, and just really quick then, did all the scientists around the whole world get together to conspire to pretend that this came from bats?
Yeah, it was really hard to fit us all in the room at the same time. Sorry, no. That I just didn't get my invite. No. So, I mean, there was some conspiracy around. There was a lab right near Wuhan that was researching these particular viruses, and the reason is, like I said before, because we were concerned about that, because we had an ear to the ground going, yeah, there are disease vectors in the wild that we need to be aware of. And so that lab was researching coronaviruses as a family. But because it was such a high level lab, the whole world knew about that lab. That was one that was internationally known about and therefore able to be inspected. And when the COVID came out, people were like, let's have a look and check to make sure there was no matching or no accidental release from that lab. And to the best of what we can know, it does not look like that was the case at all. So no, there's no grand conspiracy. Scientists, a little secret about scientists, we actually kind of hate each other, like in a competitive way, where we want, wherever possible, we try and point out how someone else is wrong. I know a lot of people think that scientists just go like, oh yeah, oh you did research, well done. Oh, you did research, well done. We're much more like, did you though? Like I don't believe you, and I'm going to spend years of my life trying to prove you wrong. That's kind of what gets us up in the morning. So the idea that a consortium of scientists just got together and decided to agree on a point, to me just shows that you don't know many scientists, because we're not that agreeable. I'm sorry.
Okay, so it came from bats, but did it come from 5G?
No. 5G is light, effectively. So 5G is part of the electromagnetic spectrum, of which visible light is a part of, kind of in a small range, where you kind of have your reds, blues. Reds are bigger wavelengths, blues are smaller wavelengths. And if you go even smaller, you get down to X-rays and gamma rays, which are quite harmful. Generally speaking, smaller wavelengths are more harmful. bigger wavelengths are less harmful, like really big wavelengths, radio waves, FM. So if you go from light up a little bit, you get to early cell technology. Up a little bit more, you're getting into 5G, where they're starting to get into those microwaves, and you'll recognize that term because if you have a microwave in your house, which heats up things. And so there is, like, with 5G, you go, okay, is it at a level at which it could heat up things or harm you from that? And the government and various agencies measure and make sure that it never goes to that level where it can actually heat. And so it is below that threshold. And then again, if you get even bigger, like if you extrapolate and you're like, 5G is worse than 4G because it's getting bigger, then the radio waves way back of like very early wireless technology would have to be so bad, and we would have already all been mind controlled, right? So no,
Okay.
5G has no way of creating a coronavirus.
Okay.
Yeah.
So
Sorry,
that's
I'm real
gone.
bad at doing quick answers.
That's okay. That's okay. We'll get there. We'll get there. But okay, so far we know for sure that scientists hate each other.
Yep.
And if they all hate each other, they're obviously not going to all come together and agree on the conspiracy
Oh yeah.
theory just to make sure that we can all die from 5G.
Yeah,
It's
like
kind of
follow
what I'm
some
hearing.
scientists on Twitter. Like even I've had recent fights on Twitter with scientists in my own building, just over trivial stuff. So like, yes, we're not a particularly agreeable bunch. So when there is an agreement amongst scientists, I think you should really pay attention to that, because that's quite phenomenal.
Okay, great, because we're going to come to that agreement among scientists. That is incredible, because it's a particularly high level of the evidence that's required for all scientists to actually accept it, right? So I'm going to come back to that in just a moment. I can see that there are some questions. So if you guys have any questions that you want us to cover, I'm going to be asking Ben questions. So put them in. So just to start off real quick before we come back to this point, Ben, because we are tonight, everyone going to be talking about vaccinations quite a bit. But just to cover off some of your questions that I've seen come through already. So one question is from Joel. What do you think about China's response to the outbreak? How would you rate their response on a scale from 1 to 10?
Yeah. So I think I'll give them like 2 or 3 scores, if that's okay. So like in terms of speed of response, they probably get a 7, maybe an 8. They were quite quick. They did delay a little bit though, right? They were slow in sharing some core pieces of information that would have helped the global effort, but only slow by a matter of weeks, kind of thing, maybe 2 or 3 weeks, and delaying that information, particularly around whether there was person-to-person transmission. That was clearly delayed, and so I think they'd definitely lose marks there. But they did tell the World Health Organization somewhat quickly. They did get sequences of the virus to the World Health Organization maybe like at most a week later than they absolutely earliest could have. So their speed of response was pretty good, but definitely had some delays there that would have helped the whole world. In terms of their dealing with it domestically, it depends how much you err on we should have freedoms versus kind of government control. Clearly, they had an effective strategy of locking down their cities, and New Zealand in a way has followed suit. Although I think the manner in which they were locked down would not have sat well with Kiwis. Is probably the best way I could say that. And it's hard to know, because obviously when you're not there, you're relying on the media that gets out. You're relying on a lot of informal sources. I have a couple friends in China that I was messaging, but again, you never know how much actually you're getting a real picture there. And so I think they did the thing that got them to a good place, especially if you compare it to some other major nations that are doing a lot worse in terms of total death toll.
USA,
and actually
for example.
Yep. Much more willing to name names. But yeah, but again, like in terms of effectiveness, they'll probably be an 8 or a 9. Like they locked down quick. They did things that nobody thought you could do, like lock down an entire city. Obviously now New Zealand has shown that you cannot lock down an entire country, and it works really well. So effectiveness, I would probably give them an 8 or a 9 there. In terms of their communication with citizens and things like that, I'd give them a much lower score, and probably around a 5 or a 4. That's
So they were
the
super
marking
slow,
rubric.
but they ended up having a very strong lockdown, which was effective. And we've actually seen really recently, I don't know if it was in the last week or if I'm just really slow on some social media things, but there was a huge pool party in Wuhan. Did you see that, Ben?
I did.
And
Yeah.
yeah, it's pretty crazy, right?
It gave me the heebie-jeebies. I was like, no,
Yeah,
no, still
I
no.
felt the same. I had that same reaction. It's so funny,
Yeah.
how you get to that point. But yeah, I also was like, oh, no physical distancing. It's too much, too close. Okay, I'm gonna just touch on. There's a couple more questions here that Okay, this might be, I don't even understand this question, but I will read it out to you, Ben. Can non-ionizing radiation affect biological cells? And can you first of all translate that question?
Okay, so non-ionizing radiation is the parts of the electromagnetic spectrum that are not ionizing. So they're not effectively changing chemicals in what they hit, right? So that the radiation just goes kind of hits it, but doesn't actually do anything when that happens. Ionizing
Okay.
radiation is like the really small stuff, which does and can cause a lot of damage. So radiation comes in, causes big damage. The non-ionizing stuff, generally the only effect it is that as it hits, energy transfers, and that's about it. So can it affect biological things? Absolutely everything affects. The question is to what degree, so yeah, there'll be some effects there. There is a small group of scientists that are very concerned about the effects of non-ionizing radiation on biological systems. And there are some interesting studies that people have tried to do. One of the main reasons that the research doesn't actually translate into real life is because they never really take into account the absorbing effect of skin. Skin is enormously effective at absorbing electromagnetic spectrum stuff. Sunlight, we're pretty good at absorbing that. I turn into a bright red peach when I spend much time in the sun. But I mean, like, there's one paper which often gets brought out and touted, going like, look, 4G, 5G, it causes cancer. The way we did this was they got some mice and some rats, and they stuck cell phones literally like to them for all hours of the day. I think they did about 12 hours a day for most of the life span of these animals. And then they showed only in male rats there was a slight increase in the number of tumors. They don't also report in that same study. Also, in the study, they also showed that all of those rats lived longer, even with the extra tumors. There was no effect in female rats. There was no effect in the mice, male or female, in that study either. And there were some issues with the baseline tumor rate of those control mice. So there are very, very few
They
studies.
don't know to what number would have had tumors anyway.
Well, the number of tumors that were found in the control mice was concerningly high. So the ones that weren't exposed is the main problem there. And so then, although there was a slightly higher number in the other group, in the group that had the cell phone strapped to them, you have to question the experimental setup if your controls are wildly out of line to where they should be. And again, all of those animals.
It's not a really good experiment to.
No, and it
base
hasn't
any
been
arguments on.
replicated either, which is
Right.
another big issue. So replication.
Okay.
Some things happen by chance. And again, like I said, all the animals actually lived longer. So if you're going to conclude from that study, you go, yeah, this is a good thing. We can live longer. We've found the secret to immortality is having a cell phone strapped to you. And also the authors of that study also concede themselves, this doesn't reflect real life usage where you're not all the time, literally, and especially like size of rat to phone, you're not getting that kind of level. And one last point on that, 5G is likely to actually emit less radiation total because it has beamforming technology and it's so much faster that you're actually connected for a lot shorter time. So you don't actually have as much connection there going on because it's a shorter, more direct to the device kind of thing.
And so Joelle wants to know, is that more or less waves hitting things than our current Wi-Fi or telco systems, that beam?
Yeah, potentially less. Because currently 4G does a big blanket, so it just goes everywhere at about 120 degree cone, whereas 5G can just go ping to your cell phone, which is pretty rad.
So if anything, it's safer than 4G is what I'm hearing.
That's what it looks like. Yeah, about the same, potentially safer.
So much misinformation out there. Okay, I'm trying to see everyone's question. Sorry if I missed yours. What is TOP going to do for the COVID long haulers and the already MECF suffers in relation to support finances, suffers in relation to support finances, community education, etc.? Okay, I might come back to that question a little bit later because we're going to come through what we say we should do. Okay, I think that's all of them. That is background information. So circling back around then, Ben, back to scientists and experimentations and the extent of scrutiny that goes into any scientific study and how the process of vaccinations being created and then that moving towards them being tested and approved and disseminated to the public. Because we're going to soon move out of the focus on the stage in COVID that we're at, and we're going to get to how do we treat it? How do we prevent it going forward? And we've seen already, even just vaccinations when it comes to things like measles, our vaccination rates have been decreasing, and public trust in understanding medical evidence, and I'm going to come back to this later on as well, but generally there's so much misinformation that circles through, especially social media and Facebook in particular, because they don't regulate anything, and people are trusting Facebook posts over their clinicians, over the scientists. So how do we or how can you explain to people a little bit about the process of vaccinations being tested and then disseminated?
Yeah, so for vaccinations, the process pretty much goes in a 3-stage trial. But before it gets to the 3-stage trial, you often put it through an animal model. So you develop your vaccine, which isn't trivial to begin with, and we can maybe circle back to that at some point if we want. But once you've got your candidate vaccine, you'll put it through an animal model. Not always, but that's quite common. And in that, you're mostly looking at, is it going to cause any negative impact? And with vaccines, there are a couple of things that can happen that you want to be very careful of. You don't want to elicit too strong an immune response. Part of what is going on with COVID is that your body reacts too strongly to the virus, and therefore you get what they call a cytokine storm. So you get too many of the things that are trying to fight the virus coming in, and it ends up causing mass inflammation in your lungs. And actually, that is what is killing some people when it comes to COVID. So sometimes too much of an immune response is bad. So you need an appropriate level. You also want to make sure that depending on what kind of virus you've got, if you've got what they call a live attenuated virus, you want to make sure that that's not going to be able to actually actively replicate, and effectively you're just infecting people. And so a live attenuated virus is one where they take the live virus, they then passage it in conditions that are very different to the human body. So low temperature is a very common one for hundreds of generations until it's picked up enough mutations that it is not able to effectively replicate in a human body. So then you can put it into the human body. It still looks like the same virus, but it can't replicate. So you can put it into the human body, and then the body will have an immune reaction to it. It will store some of those antibodies from that reaction in what they call memory cells. And then the next time you come in contact with the actual real virus, those memory cells are able to produce antibodies very quickly, and that will help you fight off the virus. So if you've got a live attenuated one, you want to really make sure that it doesn't go back and start replicating effectively. And so what you do is in a phase 1 trial is you have a very small amount or a small dosage, and you give it to very few people, and you monitor them very, very closely to see if anything's happening, and you have everything on hand to make sure that you can say, okay, is this in any way toxic? And people volunteer for those studies, which is very, very nice of them, because that enables it then to go to a phase 2. Where you recruit a lot more people. You start getting your dosages sorted out as well to make sure you understand kind of, okay, what are we going to run with? What's the effective level that we need? You also get your dosages from earlier work where you go through cell culture and things like that to get an idea of what level you need to elicit the immune response. So then in phase 2, you put it into more people. Here you're talking hundreds. And again, you're looking at safety. You're looking at, are there any side effects? And along with that, there will be incidences of illness that are not necessarily from the virus. And so the bigger the sample size, the more likely this is to happen. People just in their daily lives get sick. And so it's really important that you have a big sample size and you understand what your baseline level of sickness is, right? So I think I saw somewhere around about 1 in 100,000 people just have epileptic fits occasionally, right? It's probably actually a lot more common than that, but you know that's a thing that just happens, right? Sometimes people just have seizures or they have a fit, and you need to know what that baseline is. So then, when you're trialing your vaccine, if someone has a fit or a seizure, is that actually just part of the baseline, or is it because of this vaccine? And so you need some good statistics. You need to understand everything that is associated, that could be associated. Often that's why you get a big long list of potential side effects, and the really rare ones are things that are quite possibly just coincidental. And that's where you need a really big sample size to be able to tell that apart. So that's phase 2, where you go through and you, again, you check for efficacy. And then phase 3, you roll it out into an even bigger number. And again, you're looking for safety. Again, you're especially looking for efficacy. Up until now, you've mostly been concerned about safety. Phase 3, you really want to go, is this actually going to protect from the virus? Because with a vaccine, if it's not effective, it's actually worse, because people will think they're immune. People will think that I've been vaccinated, I don't have to take any other safety precautions, I'm good to go, I'm bulletproof. And that will be really, really detrimental to our overall approach to COVID. If we roll out a vaccine, but it's not actually effective at stopping the infection, then we're actually going to let it get away on us and we're not going to be able to control it. So phase 3, we look at efficacy as well as keeping a really close eye on that safety again. And by that stage, you've usually tried at least 5,000 people at that phase 3 trial to get an idea of the very rare events. If there are any, a 1 in 1,000 event there can actually be picked up with confidence. So at that stage, again, you've had close monitoring and you'd have an idea of how safe or unsafe that vaccine is.
Okay, and so it's only at that point that it is then released for public?
Unless you're Russia, yes.
Okay, of course.
Their Sputnik
they don't care
5
about safety.
Vaccine is been approved for wide release simultaneously with phase 3 vaccine trials going ahead in Brazil.
Oh, so they don't even know if it will work? Not
entirely, no.
So when New Zealand gets it, and we heard the Prime Minister make an announcement on that, do you want to explain to people what that might mean for New Zealand? How will we get hold of a safe, effective vaccine?
Cool. So there's one of two ways. One is we buy it, and number 2 is we make it. I'm almost certain that we're not going to develop our own. It will most likely be a licensing of one of the other ones that's being developed around the world.
And by develop, do you class a vaccine has been developed after stage 3 trials? Or is it before that process?
So what I'm saying is that New Zealand is not going to try and piece together its own vaccine, either make a live attenuated, make some conglomerate vaccine, or one of these very interesting DNA RNA vaccines. I don't think we're going to be doing that part, but we are going to be part of the evaluation of efficacy, part of the evaluation so that was part of the announcement, is that we are part of the international effort to evaluate how effective these vaccines are. We can potentially buy a license for that vaccine once it's been developed. So once it's gone through phase 3, it's shown that it's effective. We can potentially buy the license to that and then start producing it in New Zealand. We do that with animal vaccines. It's been quite effective. And so we have the potential to ramp up production and produce the vaccine here. Whether we would produce enough for all of New Zealand is dubious, and we'd really need to start ramping production early. It's not easy to grow vaccine. You effectively have to grow. It depends, again, really depends on what vaccine comes to the front, and there are 150 different vaccine candidates at the moment, based on very different technologies as well. Pardon me. So there is a wide
150
range.
options going around the world at the moment being tested.
Yeah.
That's pretty crazy.
There are 4-ish that are actually at phase 3 trials, though. Okay. So a lot of these, some of the early ones are also probably not going to be the best, right? So I think from New Zealand's point of view, we want to be quite careful about which ones we actually do ramp up and start producing, I mean, like, look, if the government's willing to throw all the money in the world at it, then sure, we can go early, get the absolutely earliest one we can. It may not be the most effective, but then we can get something. But given that we've had an elimination strategy so far, I think it's very prudent that we go, how do we maintain an elimination strategy? And a half effective vaccine is probably not the best for maintaining an elimination strategy, where we go, we really don't want any virus in here. And we also don't know how
Especially
long.
thinking of the risks you were saying earlier when you get complacent with a less than perfect effective vaccine and people think that it's great when it's not doing the job that people think that it
Yeah,
is.
yeah, exactly. And early polio vaccines were not nearly as good as the later vaccines, which took about a decade more to get really, really good, to the point where now polio has been, I should get this right, eradicated, I think, globally. I think it still crops up occasionally in some places, but it's pretty much been eliminated from the world, which is just mind-bogglingly awesome that we can do that. So yeah, we in terms of New
That's what
Zealand,
happens when you have high rates of vaccination of a disease.
hey,
Who would have thought?
2008, New Zealand had the highest level of measles vaccination in the world, and then we had
Before Facebook.
well, yes, yes. There is definitely a trend of social media information undermining that. Also, we pretty much had a government for a while that did not care about public health. And so therefore, all of those efforts in public health, like vaccinations, pretty much got put by the wayside, and we had declining rates, and then we've had measles outbreaks since then. So public health really,
When
really
you
matters.
say a government that didn't care about public health, are you talking about the years from 2008 onwards?
Yes. Um,
Wonder
fill
who
in the
that
blanks.
was. Okay.
And I mean, that's part of why TOP calls for an independent public health commission, right? Because public health is so important. If we can prevent sicknesses, it's so much better than curing sicknesses after people are sick. So yeah, on that, New Zealand, we could also buy it, right? Other countries are going to be producing it. The problem is either we get into a bidding war with the world, or we try and, like the World Health Organization is probably going to try and do some kind of allotment. New Zealand's going to be nearly the bottom because we've had such a good response, right? Because we've absolutely nailed it as Kiwis, killing this
Will be
virus.
low priority.
We're going to be so low priority. We're a well-off, wealthy nation that has virtually no virus at all. Why would you give vaccine to New Zealand when you've got it absolutely ravaging other countries, especially ones that have really poor health systems that are just, absolutely crying out for anything? So New Zealand, unfortunately, a victim of our own success there. We're going to be quite low on any kind of priority list. And then if we have to try and outbid America, who are going to show very, very nationalistic tendencies, depending on who's in charge, or even neighbors closer, like, I'm hopeful that we can work collaboratively. But internationally, I think it's a bit naive to think that all the leaders of the world are just going to start playing nice all of a sudden. So
Yeah, hard to
yeah.
imagine that would occur.
Yeah, so I think it's pretty prudent that we are starting to ramp up the potential for production. Given how long it takes to do that, I wouldn't be surprised if we pick a winner before we absolutely know how good that vaccine is. But that's very different to distributing that winner. You can maybe it's just taking a bit of a gamble and seeing if it is actually that good or not. Because there's just such a long time period from when you start production to when you actually can have a decent number of doses that you can roll out.
Okay. Well, that's really helpful background information as to vaccines. So I'm going to start going through some of these questions, Ben, and then we can feedback in Top's approach, because I think that'll sort of answer some of these questions anyways. So one question here from Michael. Do we think hotels are a viable medium or long-term solution for quarantine? If not, what's the alternative?
Great question. So quarantine is once you've been positively diagnosed with COVID. Before that, you're in a managed isolation facility. So hotels have been very convenient. They already exist. They already have lots of little rooms that you can lock people in. But and I mean, also, we don't have tourists currently occupying them, so it's really nice to the hotel owners to be able to use their facilities. Long term, we want to make sure we have something that's very sustainable. And for quarantine, a hotel might work. For a managed isolation facility, maybe not. But I think for either, you probably want a more of a purpose-built facility, especially if it depends on what our strategy is. But if we're going for a strategy where we maintain a very tight regulation on the border because worldwide vaccination programs are taking longer than expected, or they're not as effective as expected, then we're going to want to keep that border pretty tight for a long time. So we're going to need something that can handle more visitors, that's able to process them, and with a much lower chance of anything getting out. I know Labor loves to say, well, we don't have any evidence that there is actual transmission, but the Ridge Hotel worker, the maintenance worker, did contract it and did go out, and he was picked up in part because it was while the other outbreak was happening. So there was a huge heightened awareness and huge heightened sense of testing. We're not going to be able to maintain our current testing rates, not because we don't have the supply, just it naturally falls away as the threat abates. And so if we get to a point,
as we saw over the last the previous 100 days.
Exactly. And so there will be times when we put up our feet and we say we've done a good job, and we need to be very, very cautious. And so that's why I think long term, we want to be looking at something a bit more purpose-built. We definitely want to be looking at something outside of Auckland or zones that are heavily influential to New Zealand's overall economic well-being. And so I've seen some really interesting suggestions of some military bases where you could land international planes. You could have really interesting sorting facilities and regular testing. There's a university in the States that's testing every single student twice a week. And they've developed a saliva test instead of a full nasopharyngeal swab, which is much less invasive. And I mean, that one university is doing 1% of the entire of the US's testing just on its students.
Wow.
And again, that's just a university was able to get approval for the test, so they were able to show that it was good enough to the FDA, I think is the one that approves that. And then they just went with it and they did it. And that's fantastic. I think there is so much room for innovating and for utilizing our incredible researchers to have these really, really great innovations. I've seen other fantastic protocols if we want to get super nerdy around around full genome sequencing, high throughput sequencing that can do thousands of samples at a time, give you interesting genomic data at the same time. So there's a lot of really awesome innovation that's going on that if we're thinking long term, you'd integrate that into the plan. And I don't know whether hotels are actually the most sensible long-term plan. I really don't think hotels in Auckland are a sensible long-term plan.
No, get them out of our city. Thank you. Okay, I'm just going to scroll down all of your questions, everybody. We'll try and get to as many as they can. Okay, Ben, super quick one. Are some blood types able to fight coronavirus better than other blood types? Have you seen any stats on certain blood types contracting COVID more easily?
I have heard early reports. There was some interesting papers that came out that looked at blood type association with COVID infection. I can't recall it. And I'm beyond that. Yeah, I'm sorry. There was definitely some early research on that. And unfortunately, I don't have it at my fingertips. I could do a quick Google in the meantime. But yeah, so yes, but no. Yes, I think from the conclusion from that study was that there was some effect. The size of that effect was not a massive magnitude that if you have a certain blood type, you're immune. If you have a different one, you're not. So it's not that any blood types are immune. There is a small effect based on that one paper, but I don't have it in front of me.
Okay. There's a really long question here, Ben, that you can maybe come back to later. So sorry to that person, but we would be here for a while, just me reading it. No disrespect, but Ben will come back to you after. Cool, I'm sorry, there's some others coming up. Lots of good messages coming through. Good question here from Chris. Are cheap universal paper COVID tests a potential path out of lockdowns?
Cheap universal paper tests?
Paper COVID tests. I don't know what that means.
The main issue with any kind of test in place of a lockdown is the detectability limit. So COVID is quite a slow burn. It takes a while from infection until you show symptoms. You're infectious before you show symptoms by a significant margin. And so it really comes down to how sensitive that test is and then how frequently you're administering it. If you have, so say the Auckland cluster that's happening now, and you're going, right, let's use these paper tests instead of locking down the city, you would effectively need to have people being tested daily in order to get that, and that's millions of tests a day, which is a
There's no
huge.
way we could do that, right? We
Well,
would just not
that
have
is the
that
question,
capacity.
right? Like, is that capacity possible? If yes, maybe it's worth it. Again, if you had a smaller city, or if you knew the zone smaller, maybe, but people move around so much that I think you could potentially do a shorter lockdown with it, right? So you could do a much shorter lockdown with then testing if everybody had it. Like, you could distribute a, I don't know, you'd have to find some very effective mechanism of distributing it to everybody, get everybody to test, and you might be able to get that idea, right? We're having about 10,000 tests a day. That's still quite a small population of Auckland that actually gets tested. It's a lot of, you have to have symptoms, or you have to have some reasonable contact in order to get tested. If you had a test that was cheap enough that you could actually do that, possibly, that could be a way forward. Logistically, that's huge to actually roll out, like on the order
So
of.
really, in theory, you could avoid lockdowns or have super short ones because, let's say, arguably in a hypothetical world, in 48 hours, everybody could do a quick COVID test, find out if
Yep.
you've got COVID. If not, out you go from lockdown.
Yeah, and you could quickly rule out regions if you had whole portions of Auckland that weren't, and you might need to restrict travel a bit more in some of the regions that do pop up. But again, you would still need at least kind of a week. COVID is just so slow. It's frustratingly slow from infection to symptom, and infection to actually being able to accurately be tested, right? A lot of people were getting picked up at the 12-day test, not at the 3-day test.
There was something I wanted to ask you about. So we found out this week that there haven't been any compulsory 3-day tests, but the only compulsory test now is at day 12. Is that too late? Do you think that makes sense? Should it be a 3-day and a 12-day, both compulsory?
I think I'm always reluctant on compulsory testing, just because I think you want to. It's a high bar, really, to force a medical procedure on someone, and a COVID test is still a medical procedure. I think I don't know enough about how the managed isolation facilities actually work in terms of the mingling of people in their rooms, or how much potential cross contamination there is between people in those units. If there is none, if people are literally in a room where they have no outside contact, then I don't think it really matters too much if you have a 3 and a 12, because you will pick them up eventually. And I heard that if you refuse, then you have to wait till 28, and also be symptom free. And so if you've reached 28 days with no contact from anyone and you're still symptom free, then the chance that you actually have COVID, regardless of testing status, very, very, very low. And so, yeah, I think, but if there's mingling, right? If you're in a managed isolation is actually you have outside time, or you get some contact with people up and down the hall, then absolutely you need to be doing that testing. Otherwise, you're going to potentially infect multiple people late in their stay, and then they'll be able to get out and while having a negative test. If they get infected on day 11, they'll probably be negative on day 12. On day 20, they're going to start infecting people in the community by the time they're already out. So it really depends on how much actual interaction happens in those facilities. If you're actually completely isolated, I think you can get away with not doing a 3-day. But then I think you'd probably be in the quarantine, not in the managed isolation. So I would need to know more about how those hotels run. And I'm really not about to go break into one to see how they operate.
No, it's probably wise. I'd recommend against that. Now, the last thing I wanted to cover off with you tonight, Ben, before we go, is because you mentioned that obviously there's a super high bar for requiring people to undergo any medical procedure, and as minor and as least invasive as it is, a COVID test is arguably still a procedure, though required. So in some cases for some people in those facilities. So we have a current sitting MP who has doctored videos to suggest to their followers that the government has planned mandatory vaccinations which is ridiculous because the government has said very clearly from day one, as has every party, very clearly from day one, that they will not be mandating vaccinations. Do you want to just comment on that, Ben? Because there is just some wild stories going on out there in the socials world, and we need to just call that shit out because it's ridiculous.
It's really, really deeply troubling. It's an erosion of democratic norms, and it's very frustrating when, and especially we as a party and myself, we spend so much time making sure we're speaking accurately. And to your point just before, I think even the 12th day one isn't mandatory. If you do turn that down, and there have been 15 people so far that have declined it, you just have to do that extra stay. So you have to go to your 28-day stay instead of 14. And again, like I said, if you're in for 28 days, chance of having the virus then and not showing any symptoms and still being able to spread it virtually zero. It is above zero. It's like 0.00001 type situation. But yeah, I mean, like, no, it's absurd, right? If you're an MP, you're on real good money already, right? There is a high bar for your behavior. You're doing like
our money, our time.
Yeah. I mean, absolutely. I know it's something that we're actively campaigning to be a part of, right? We're saying, look, we want to have that job. I want to be able to bring my integrity into that space, because you see how people are behaving. You see the way that not just doctoring of images, but illegal attaining information and then distributing it. Again, it's really concerning that is the level at which they're willing to go to keep power. Right, because at the end of the day, that's what it's about. It's that individual, I assume we're talking about Jamie Lee Ross here, is so concerned about keeping his job. He's so concerned about that he's trying to start his own party. He's trying to get in bed with absolutely anybody that will, to give him money to try and stay there. And we can certainly see it from some other parties as well that are making very dubious alliances with groups, hoping just to secure their vote, pandering to them effectively.
It's exactly what's happening. No integrity, no credibility, all for power rather than all for outcomes that are going to take care and be in the best interest of all New Zealanders. And it's got to be called out because it's disgusting, quite frankly.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, it's shocking and it shouldn't be allowed. And I'm not the legal expert here, but it feels like there should be something, some bar, some test that if MPs lie that blatantly, that there can be consequences. At the end of the day, I don't think that you can use Parliament as a platform.
I mean, the best we've got, you're dead right. I mean, the best first step is he's going to be hauled before the Privileges Committee on, I think, Monday. Someone can fact check me, but it's soon. So that's a good step. But you're right, there's not good enough checks and balances. I mean, the fact that Michael Woodhouse, for example, who received this information, when he received the confidential information and said nothing, and then tried to haul the government over coals over information he himself had received, and he still has a job, and he is still running to be a candidate going forward. I mean, this is just baffling. That we continue to allow these people in, and he'll be so high up the list that he doesn't even need to get voted in. He's just going to be there regardless.
Oh, he's almost guaranteed to lose the electorate seat, but probably again that goes to David Clark or me if you are
probably more likely you at the moment.
Absolutely, but we just need people to turn up and actually vote.
Vote these people
it's
out.
Not okay. That's the thing. They will respond and like immediately if people actually turn up and vote. If young people at the moment, 18 to 24, if you haven't enrolled yet, go and enroll because your vote counts. In Dunedin, there are enough students that students alone can determine that electorate. There are so many of you down here. I teach a lot of you, but there are so many that you can actually genuinely say what students want happens and we can choose our MP. So, I mean, that just blows my mind, but not enough of them enroll. And so then not enough of the student issues get brought into Parliament because not enough of them vote.
Totally true. So anyone out there listening who is actually in Dunedin and can vote for Ben, you have somebody who will have integrity and credibility and actually the smarts we need in the next government to be dealing with this hugely complex matter. So vote for Ben.
Thanks, Shai.
And Dunedin would be incredibly lucky to have you. As Top is incredibly lucky to have you, Ben, and I always learn so much whenever I talk to you, even if sometimes my brain feels a little bit overused, but it's good.
It is
I
good.
really
It is good.
appreciate your knowledge.
No worries at all. I'm pleased that all my day reading comes into use at night.
It sure does. So, everybody, thank you so much for joining us this evening, and I hope you all have lovely weekends, even if you're in Auckland like me and there's not a lot we can do yet, but only 2 more days, and then we can see our friends and family again. So, stay safe out there and take care.
Awesome. See you
Thanks,
later.
Ben.